So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar from CQ and Fiscal Note. We're delighted to have you along. And today, unless you've been kind of hiding under a rock, you'll know that there's a very important election coming up. And so hence today's webinar 2 months to the midterms. And I'm tempted to yell out, are you ready? Because, of course, for a lot of folks on the line, there's a lot of issues at play that may change or may not change, things that may move a little faster through Congress, and of course from the governor races through the states. So delighted to that end to have Bridget Bowman along today. Bridget is our senior political reporter covering congressional races here at CQ Roll Call. And she's originally from Buffalo, New York, and studied political science at Holy Cross. And before she came to us, she was at the PBS NewsHour. And Bridget, of course, lives and breathes all this stuff. And she's been out on the trail, and she's going to share some of her insights today with us. And it's kind of a two-part webinar. After Bridget has spoken, we'll speak to Megan McCoskey. And Megan is CQ Advocacy's product manager here, and she works with nonprofits and trade associations and corporate clients to kind of help them leverage the most of their advocacy platform. Just to let you know, we will be sending out this recording after the webinar, and the other thing is if you do have questions for Bridget or for Megan, please put them in the Q&A box throughout the webinar. We won't get to answer them until we get to the end, but you can ask the questions at any time during the webinar. So with that, one thing I did want to kind of draw your attention to is Roll Call's 2018 election guide. This is a great interactive election guide on their website where you can see what's at play in the House and in the Senate and kind of play around with the map and see your individual state or the individual state that you're most interested in. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bridget. And Bridget, I suppose let's start with one big general question. You know, what's the biggest thing to know about these midterms and how are they different from previous midterms?
I think the biggest thing to know about the midterms this cycle is that control of Congress could change, that there could be a different party in charge of the House or in charge of the Senate, and that changes the dynamics of how they work together with the White House, what happens in Congress, how much can get done. So that's the biggest thing to watch is will Congress flip party control? In terms of just the bigger picture here, there are kind of different dynamics if you're looking at House races versus Senate races. So in the House, Republicans are largely on defense. The election guide that Ann mentioned, which is on our site, hosts race ratings from Inside Elections with Nathan Gonzalez. So it lists all the competitive races, which races are favored towards Democrats, which are favored towards Republicans, which are toss-ups. And there are 86 House races on that list that are listed as competitive this year, which is a lot. And to give you a sense of how much Republicans are on defense, 77 of those 86 races are Republican-held seats. Only 9 Democratic-held House seats are considered competitive this cycle. So again, Republicans largely looking across the map, trying to put out fires where they can and really make sure that they hold on to the majority. Just as a refresher, too, Democrats need to flip 23 seats, need a net gain of 23 seats, that is, so they could lose a couple, gain a couple to get that net gain of 23 seats to win back the House. On the Senate side is a different story. Here, a lot of the action is in red states, and on the Senate side, Democrats are on defense. So there are 14 competitive Senate races. 10 of those Senate seats are held by Democrats, and 4 are held by Republicans. There are a couple of toss-up seats, too, and here in both the House and the Senate, we see open seats being among the most competitive races. So it looks like, as we're kind of looking at the broader dynamics, I think the question is how energized are Democrats going to be this cycle? If they are going to flip the House or if they even have a shot at flipping the Senate, what does that look like? Is it going to be a close margin or a wide margin in the House? And those are kind of all the dynamics that we're watching, and it is, like I said, tricky because Republicans are largely on defense in the House, Democrats are defending their Senate seats, and they're happening in very different parts of the country as well. So kind of a lot of different things going on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose one thing I should alert everybody is that we will send a link to the recording of this webinar tomorrow. And also, if you do have any questions for Bridget or later for Megan, please put them in the Q&A box. We won't take them until the end, but you can put them in at any stage throughout the webinar. So, Bridget, I suppose I've pulled up here the screen for the House. Let's start with that and kind of talk a little more about sort of what states in particular we should be looking at.
Sounds good. So it varies. This cycle, the House map and the Senate map don't really overlap. So here we're just looking at the House races. You can see a lot of red in the middle of the country. The yellow districts up here are toss-up races as well. So some of the key states to watch are states that are hosting multiple competitive House races. And a lot of these competitive House races are in the suburbs, are in places that maybe Hillary Clinton won in 2016, or places that flipped from a district that voted for President Barack Obama in 2012 or 2008 and then flipped to support President Trump in 2016. So those kind of two buckets of districts are places where Democrats are really targeting. So in terms of what states might help determine whether or not the House flips, some states to watch are definitely Minnesota. There are 5 competitive House races in that state. There's also 2 Senate races in that state, which is kind of unique. So Minnesota, California is another one, a bunch of competitive House races there. About 9, 7 of them are Republican-held seats that Clinton won in 2016. New York will be another state to watch. And these, again, are both big states with a lot of House districts, you know, so a lot of races to watch there at all. But these states are also hosting competitive House races. So New York is another one. Pennsylvania, definitely one to watch. I'm not sure how closely you all followed, but the Pennsylvania House map was redrawn after a court ruling. So Democrats, it got a lot more favorable to Democrats when they drew out the new line. So there are 9 competitive House seats in Pennsylvania, which is half the number of House seats in the state. And also Illinois is another one to watch. So on the House side, again, it's Minnesota, California, New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. And if you want to dig more into these specific states, our colleague at Inside Elections, Nathan Gonzalez, wrote a column last week detailing, like, what are the chances for Democrats in each of these states and how many of these races do Democrats have to win to make sure that they flip the House. So you can kind of dig a little deeper if you want to check out that column as well. Oh, I can talk about the Senate, too, if that works. So on the Senate side, as I mentioned before, you kind of have an opposite dynamic. So the fight for the Senate is really happening in red rural states. So the states to watch here are definitely the 10 states that President Trump won in 2016 that are currently held by Democratic senators. So those states include West Virginia, North Dakota, Montana, Missouri, Indiana. Those 5 states are all states that the president won by big margins in 2016. Other states to watch include Florida, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. So again, those are places where Senate Democrats are on defense. Some other states to watch in the Senate, Minnesota, as I mentioned, because it has 2 Senate races going on. Arizona and Nevada, Democrats are looking at those 2 states. Those are both Republican-held Senate seats. They're looking at those 2 states as key pickup opportunities for them potentially. And also Tennessee, which is an open Senate seat race because Republican Senator Bob Corker is retiring. So Democrats think they could have a pretty good shot at that seat due to the candidate that they have there. But Tennessee, again, is still a pretty Republican state. So yeah, a lot to watch in all of these different states for sure.
Certainly a lot to watch, and that's not even kind of mentioning all the governor seats that are up as well this year. But so in terms of the legislation, when we're looking at kind of either flipping or maintaining the status quo, and how that will affect congressional gridlock, you know, do you think there'll be more or less gridlock, or more or less, I guess, if there could be less bipartisanship?
That's a really good question. I think that depends on if either one or both of the chambers flips, and by what extent they flip, if that makes sense. So if Democrats win back the House, do they win it by, you know, a handful of seats or a lot of seats? And actually, this is an interesting question that was raised to Democratic Congressman Kurt Schrader of Oregon, recently, he is the head of the Blue Dog Coalition PAC, and he actually told reporters recently that a single-digit majority for Democrats would be a sweet spot for them. Remember, these are Democrats that are fiscally conservative, that tend to be more moderate, and he sees a small majority as the place where this coalition of Democrats could have more influence in final products of legislation. So I think the question is, if it's a small margin, if the House is divided by just a small margin of folks, does that mean we have effectively a coalition government where you have to have portions like we see now on different spending bills, where you have portions of Republicans and portions of Democrats having to come together to get some of these big things done, or are you going to see a lot more gridlock? It kind of depends on, like I said, on the margin. I think another thing to watch to look at the answer to this question is where some of these new members of Congress are winning. So we see a lot of Democrats right now running in seats that are either traditionally Republican or swing seats, and they're running against gridlock in Washington. They're saying, we want to change things, Washington is not working for us, that they are willing to work across the aisle. So if these folks win these districts, are they then incentivized to cut deals with Republicans, to maybe break with their party when necessary, when they view it as necessary? I think that will be a key question going into next year, and those would be the members of Congress to watch, those, especially those Democrats, I think, that who are maybe favored to win in some of these Republican-held seats, who will be running again in just a couple of years and will have to say to voters, make their case that I did what I said I would do and I worked across the aisle. So those will be definitely folks to watch.
Great. So you kind of answered this, I guess, Bridget, but, you know, what does that change in control mean for the different factions within each party?
Right. I think it definitely depends how much each faction, I mean, if you look at the new members of Congress, if you look at the folks who win, maybe who donated to their campaigns, if the Blue Dog Coalition endorsed them or if the House Freedom Caucus endorsed them, you can kind of get a sense of where the freshman class is going to fall. And it also, like I said, in terms of Congressman Schrader's remark, if it's a small margin, do certain factions, if they have the ability to band together like the Freedom Caucus does, do they become stronger and do they wield more influence in the party in some of these big deals that Congress has to craft? I think another interesting question which we see emerging right now on the campaign trail is we're going to have leadership fights in both parties, with Speaker Ryan retiring, with a lot of Democratic candidates saying they won't vote for Nancy Pelosi. It'll be interesting to see how those leadership fights develop and what factions of the parties try to step forward to influence some of those battles and what that means for how the parties move forward together. I think we'll just have to see sort of where these new members come from and how these coalitions try to wield some power here.
Right. And I suppose one big thing this year that we can't kind of not talk about is all the women who are running, right? It's kind of an exceptional year on that front. I mean, how do you see that kind of playing out, or maybe talk a little about how that sort of shaped this midterm?
Sure. So this is a big storyline, as I'm sure you've all seen lots of stories about all the women who have been running for Congress this cycle. And it's really interesting, actually, thinking back to the Women's March, and I covered that with one of my colleagues, and I remember running into a woman who was there who had a sign that said, like, 600-something days until the midterms. And at that point, it seemed so far away, but it was just a sign that even then there were women who were energized by, it is in part a reaction to President Trump, and who wanted to take action. And the question after that march was that energy sustainable? Would people actually run? And we're seeing that they are running and they're winning. And this also is mostly on the Democratic side at this point, but the Center for American Women and Politics, which is run out of Rutgers, actually does a great breakdown of all of this. They've been tracking women candidates dating back to the 1970s, and they found record amounts of women running and women winning their primaries. So to, excuse me, sorry, to give you a sense of kind of where that is, so on the House side, this year we saw 476 women file to run for the House. About half of them, 232, won their primaries. So in terms of party nominees, the highest number of nominees before that was 167 in 2016. So big jump from what was the highest number to this year, on the Senate side, again, we saw 53 women file to run for the Senate, 22 won their primaries, and this is also mostly skewed towards Democrats. We largely see this energy coming from Democratic women candidates. So it will be really interesting to see how this shapes the new Congress as well. We could see a reduction in the number of women Republicans in the House, especially. We saw a number of women Republicans either retire or decide to run for higher office. So, and there are a handful of Republican women candidates who party strategists say are very strong and could win, but it'll have to see kind of how that number shakes out. But we are at least looking at potentially big number of Democratic women coming to Congress. So another key question when it comes to the influence that women will have on this election are women voters themselves, not just candidates. So Democrats see moderate women, especially maybe women Republicans or highly educated women independent voters, those voters who are in the suburbs, in those Clinton districts, as key to winning back the House. They are looking at those women who are especially disapproving of the president to maybe side with Democrats this time, and maybe they couldn't vote for him last time but voted for Hillary Clinton, voted for their Republican congressperson, and Democrats this time are hoping they'll vote for the Democrat instead. So that will be a key demographic certainly to watch heading into November.
Yeah, definitely a really interesting kind of twist to this year. So tell us a little bit, kind of, Bridget, because none of us are out there on the trail, obviously. You know, what are you hearing from voters in competitive states and districts specifically this year?
Sure. So I've gotten on the trail a little bit. I was actually most recently in Missouri and Kansas. I was in Kansas City, so I was going with the Missouri Senate race, which again is a red state, a state that President Trump won by a big margin, and then crossing over the line to Kansas in the Kansas City suburbs with the Kansas 3rd District, which is Congressman Kevin Yoder. He is in a competitive House race there. So kind of going between, in a matter of days, back and forth between these two different dynamics. On the Senate side in Missouri, Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill was definitely emphasizing a lot about health care, and I heard that from voters I talked to, too, that people are concerned about the rising cost of health care. And that's something we see among Democratic candidates in the House and Senate across the country. Health care is the #1 issue for them this cycle. From Republican voters in Missouri, I remember I was canvassing with a Republican volunteer, and we ran into a man who said he was a Republican and said he would be voting for Josh Hawley, the Attorney General, and he was doing that because he wanted someone who supported President Trump. He was a big Trump supporter. He wanted someone who would push forward his agenda, and he was also staunchly pro-life, so that was a big issue for him as well. And these are all, of course, anecdotal and not representative of the entire voting population, but just, it is interesting to hear these different conversations and kind of out there. And then going over the border to the Kansas House district, that was also interesting in terms of Congressman Kevin Yoder is having to kind of draw a line and point out places where he does disagree with the president. And we see this in a number of competitive House districts where Republican incumbents are on defense. They're having to say, you know, I will break with my party when I think it's necessary. And Congressman Yoder points to a statement criticizing the family separation at the border as an example of that. Both Congressman Yoder and the Democrat in that district, who's an attorney, Sharice Davids, they both agree that health care is a big issue for voters there. Education is a big issue for their voters. They also both agree that gun violence is an important issue, and I ran into an independent voter who said he's very concerned about gun violence, and that's a new-ish issue this cycle, I think, in terms of the conversation on the campaign trail. So it will be interesting to see, to kind of watch how many candidates keep talking about that issue as well. And Sharice Davids is actually also somewhat emblematic of, we see in a number of races, people who could make history if they win. She could be one of the first Native American women in Congress. She could be the first LGBT person to represent Kansas in Congress. So kind of an interesting microcosm in that district, and it was fun to be there on the ground and talk to voters. And I think there is a general frustration as I'm out there talking to people, just the gridlock and chaos in D.C. People are just kind of tired of it. So it's going to be tricky, I think, for incumbents to try and break apart from that and say, I'm different, I work across the aisle, and that's certainly the challenge that they have and the message that they're trying to move forward.
Okay, I mean, of course, one big thing for the midterms is people actually showing up to vote, right? And you mentioned education and healthcare and gun violence as sort of big issues this year. We know that when voters go to the polls in presidential elections, they generally ask something like, how well am I doing, right? How's my economic state? What do you think the big questions they're asking this year are?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the big questions, and you see this in what Republicans and Democratic candidates are saying to voters, I think one of the big questions folks are asking is, who's going to fight for me? Who's going to have my interest in mind when they go back to D.C.? And you see Democrats saying, your Republican hasn't had your interest in mind, they're tied to D.C., vote for me instead. And you see Republicans trying to make, specifically Republican incumbents in the House, trying to make that argument that I do fight for you, and here's how, and here's what I've done. I think another question is in terms of the economy that you kind of mentioned. Republicans are hoping that a strong economy will help push them forward and help stave off some potential losses in the House. Democrats, on the other hand, though, see a real opportunity to win back the House this year in terms of tying these incumbent Republicans either to the president or saying that they haven't, done enough to address rising costs in health care, that they are pointing to the Republican attempts to repeal parts of the Affordable Care Act as evidence that Republicans aren't protecting you when they go back to Washington, that they'll side with their party. So you kind of see, like I said, underlying those different messages in terms of when people talk about various issues is the fundamental question of who are you going to fight for? And candidates trying to tell voters, I'll fight for you. And the question, I guess, is who will voters believe? And we're going to find that out in a couple months.
Well, that brings us kind of nicely to another question, sort of what role does the president play in the midterm elections traditionally and then specifically, I suppose, this year?
Right. So midterm elections are often cast as a referendum on the president, and that is certainly still the case this year. Typically, in the first midterm of a president's term in office, they tend to lose about 30 seats, so that's obviously more than the 23 that Democrats need to flip the House. So I think that Democrats are looking at that and automatically know that they have an advantage. And Republicans, too, acknowledge they went into this cycle looking at history, knowing that this is going to be a tough year. I think maybe a difference this cycle is that President Trump has, and Republicans acknowledge this as well, that President Trump has certainly energized Democrats to a new level that they haven't seen in a while, that people are, a strategist told us the other day, people are just waiting to vote. Like they have been wanting to vote for months on the Democratic side. So you do see kind of maybe a heightened reaction to the president in that sense. However, on the flip side, that's talking mostly about the House. When we're looking at the Senate map, and these are states where the president is still very popular, these 10 states that Senate Democrats are defending that he won in 2016, that's where you see President Trump really going out on the trail, holding rallies, trying to rile up his base of supporters and saying, if you support me, if you support my agenda, you need to support the Republican candidate in this Senate race. So again, you see this kind of maybe another referendum on the president on the House, but on the Senate side, could his popularity help boost some of these Republican challengers? We're going to have to see how that plays out. But, yeah, that's sort of where you see President Trump playing into all of this. And Vice President Pence, too, has been out on the campaign trail. He has been making some more appearances, I think, on the House side. But the President Trump certainly is looked at as an asset for some of these Senate Republicans.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that overview. And, Bridget, I suppose we can't go without asking you the big question. What's your prediction?
Well, it's very tough to make a prediction, but it seems like right now that just looking at the numbers, Democrats are in a good position to win back the House. I think it's still a very open question, and by how many seats might they win back the House, especially with some of these Republican incumbents are looked at as very strong incumbents, people who have their own brands in their districts. If some of those folks start to lose, I think that it looks like that could probably be a big night for Democrats, but still seems unclear right now. On the Senate side, it still looks like a very tough path for Democrats to flip the Senate. Just, again, looking at the numbers, they're defending so many more seats than they're targeting. They would have to win most, if not all, of the states that President Trump won. I think they're in better positions than they maybe thought they would be a few months ago, given the nature of some of these Republican challengers and just the strength of some of the Democrats' own brands in their district, but still looks like a tough path. So it looks like kind of what we've thought since the beginning of the cycle, that Democrats look like they might win back the House and the Senate might stay Republican. But we'll have to wait and see. As one operative told me after the Alabama Senate race, like, you know, nobody knows what could happen anymore. But that's kind of what it's looking like right now.
Okay, great. And thank you again, Bridget Bowman from CQ Roll Call. Before I go over to Megan, again, just wanted to reiterate, if you do have some questions for Bridget or for Megan, please put them in the Q&A box. And of course, like we mentioned, unless people actually turn out to vote, nothing really changes on kind of any side, right? So I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to find Megan's presentation, so bear with me for a minute.
And it looks like we're up. So let me go ahead and get started. Okay, and we'll go through some of the reasons why we would use these GOTV tools to get your membership or your advocate base involved. And one of the biggest reasons is to provide them with easy centralized resources. And so especially if you're working across multiple states, you could be in a position where you are sending your members to all kinds of different Secretary of State websites to get access to information about where they vote, how they vote, what information they need to bring with them. And so it's nice as both a member benefit as well as a way to position yourself as a thought leader, someone that they think about when they think about policy and advocacy, to provide them with a place that they can come, enter their information, be branded with your info, and branding and logo as well, and find out where they vote, when they vote, and how they vote. Along with that, here at CQ and Fiscal Note, we have a team of researchers that not only focuses on elected officials at the federal, state, and local level, but also focuses on federal and state candidate information. And we allow your users or your advocates or members to access that information using maps or lookup modules, and we'll include contact information, biographical info, and this can be especially hard to bring together at the state level, which is why we think it's so important to give that tool to our customers. And so they can learn more about candidates, bio, contact, see who they're running against, all from one centralized location. And then once your advocates know who they're going for, you've established yourself as a thought leader, you're able to utilize some tools in the form of our engagements or calls to action in the Engage product so that they can email candidates, pledge to vote to increase your involvement in voter turnout, and to register to vote as well through the tool. The email tool is especially interesting after the elections, because we will drop the losers from the database as races are called. And so it's one of the only ways that you can have your members reach out to these elected officials before they officially take office. And it is a call that I get every year asking, when can we reach out to these new people? And so the first one is these candidate letters. As I mentioned, we collect the information for both the federal and the state candidates so that you can build a letter just like you would in a typical Write Congress call to action, but instead focus it at candidates so you can have your advocates introducing themselves to the people who could be representing them, explaining the importance of your issues to them, and really establishing a relationship before they even make it into office. Then you can also use pledges. So within the Engage tool, there is a great petition functionality that serves a lot of different purposes. I know I've talked before about getting your advocates to pledge to meet with their elected officials in the summer recess, but you can also have them pledge to vote. And this will help grow your database. It's a way to gauge who's interested in voting, even if they are already registered. You can reach out to your pledges to spur follow through, and then perhaps most importantly, studies show that you can get voters who pledge in advance can increase the turnout by a nice little percentage point. Voter registration. This tool, again, captures information about who is interested in voting because they are going to register through your site, and it's going to make their way into your database. It'll use the National Mail Voter Registration Form. You can reach out to them along with the people who pledge to vote with the GOTV tools to encourage them to go out, look up where they need to vote, and get to the polls on that day. And Engage, we make putting these together really, really easy. So if you are an Engage customer, when you log into your account, if you go underneath the little site navigation, you can go right to the election page, and we will walk you through a wizard of setting up all of these resources in a very easy way. And then, of course, once the elections are over and folks, the races are called, use those candidates, write a letter, call to actions to reach out to folks ahead of them taking office. And once they do take office, especially if we do have a year where there is a lot of turnover, be sure to utilize your Knowledges tools if you are a Knowledges customer to start making relationships with the staffers in these new offices. Again, we have a team of researchers who are on the ground going office to office and making sure we get staff lists updated as soon as they become available.
Okay, great. Thank you, Megan. And I know we do have a webinar planned for just after the midterms on how to kind of, I don't want to say ingratiate yourself, but how to start building those relationships with the new members, because of course for a lot of folks it's kind of starting from scratch again and educating them on your issues and all of that good stuff. So keep an eye out for that. So I wanted to go to some questions. We did have one for Bridget on, let me just pull that up here. It is, where are the first 5 states to watch you listed on the Senate side? I heard West Virginia.
Sure. So the 5 states, the first 5 states are the states that the president won by a big margin. So those include West Virginia, North Dakota, Montana, Missouri, and Indiana. And again, if you're kind of interested in digging into this more and what states are competitive, if you go to rollcall.com, on our politics page, there will be a link at the top to the election guide, which has the map that we showed earlier, as well as a list underneath it of the states and where those states are rated. And you can kind of click on that and get a deeper dive into the state. So you can definitely use that as a resource as well.
Okay, great. And I think we have time for one more question. With President Trump and former President Obama stumping for political candidates across the country, how much might this affect voter turnout, if it affects it at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. It seems like party strategists, people like that, think that these kind of big figures coming to different districts, different states, help energize base voters, so maybe reminds them that there's an election coming up, reminds them who the candidate is that either President Trump or President Obama is supporting, kind of boost name recognition. They can get local media coverage when there's a big visit there. The extent to which it boosts turnout, I think, is kind of an open question. This kind of dilemma we saw with President Obama's voters and the question we have about President Trump's voters is whether those voters will still turn out. Midterm elections tend to have much lower turnout than presidential years, so will the same coalition of voters that supported both those presidential candidates turn out for their party's candidates? Kind of remains to be seen. We didn't really see that happen with Democrats in the midterms when President Obama was president, so we'll have to see if that same thing happens with President Trump's voters. I think we're going to have to wait to see, I guess, how that plays out.
Okay, great. And one more, Bridget. I promise we'll let you go then. So what is currently happening with the open Senate seat in Arizona due to the death of Senator McCain and, of course, the retirement of Senator Bob Corker, right?
Yep.
Senator Jeff Flake in Arizona. So the Flake retirement led to an open Senate seat. There we have Democratic Congresswoman Kirsten Sinema facing Republican Congresswoman Martha McSally. It's a toss-up Senate race. President Trump won it by a smaller margin, so Democrats see a real opportunity there. In terms of the Senator McCain seat, that one was kind of tricky because it depended on the timing of his passing. So because he passed away late in the year, that the governor had appointed a successor, that's former Senator John Kyle, who was recently sworn in to fill that seat. So there will be a special election in 2020 to fill out the rest of that Senate term, which ends in 2022. So Senator McCain's term ends in 2022, and there's a special election in 2020 for those last few seats. And that's just kind of because of the way that Arizona election law deals with filing deadlines and things like that. So even though Senator McCain passed away this year, there is not a special election in November for that Senate seat.
Okay, great. Well, that kind of clears it up, and apologies to anybody in Tennessee or Arizona for my flub earlier. And that's about all the time we have today. Thank you again to Megan McCoskey and to Bridget Bowman. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.